kind of the breakdown of what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to kind of talk about my own work within kind of public scholarship and engagement. And then I'm going to go on to kind of like greater tips and toolkits and so forth. Please excuse the noise in the background. Okay, so I'm going to move to the next slide. For people who are blind or have difficulty seeing, I'm not going to spend too much time describing what's on the slides because it's basically just a lot of the words in bullet points, but there's some like kind of purple graphics to do it. But if you are unable to see the slides, you're not really missing anything like visually that you need represented. If there's any slide that does have a visual component, I will explain it to you. Okay, so for a little bit of background about me, so I'm the faculty lecturer at McGill University's Institute for Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies. One of the things that I do as part of my role within that institute is I am the director of the Just Feminist Tech and Scholarship Lab, and I also direct and organize the speaker series, Disrupting Disruptions, the Feminist and Accessible Publishing, Communications, and Technology Speaker and Workshop Series. It's a really long name. When I first started out the series, I didn't really imagine it growing to what it is today. So I didn't think too critically about the title. And then when I made the first URL, I was like, no one's going to remember this. So I made it disruptingdisruptions.com as a bit of like a tongue-in-cheek about all this discussion around disruption. And then now the title is just ridiculous. So I apologize for that. But what I'm really interested in with this series is thinking through research communication and outreach surrounding artificial intelligence, AI, and kind of big data. So I know the series really talks about science and data communication. We don't really talk too much around AI and health. But you can kind of think of health in an expanded sense in terms of health of society in that kind of way. And with this speaker series, I was really interested in creating a platform in a very interdisciplinary way, and also bringing together scholars, activists, artists, people in industry, working at the intersections of, as I have in the slide, digital humanities, computer science, feminist studies, disability studies, communication studies, LGBTQ studies, history and critical race theory. So I want to bring in a lot of different perspectives on these topics and also elevate the voices of women, non-binary people, trans people, people of color, and LGBTQ and disabled people who are doing work on these issues. So I really wanted to share more perspectives on AI and big data that aren't often platformed. And part of the drive for doing this is that I'm located in Montreal, or Tiohtià:ke, and Montreal kind of sees itself as this center of AI, especially around 2017, 2018. There's a lot of beginning investment in AI in the city. And I thought it was important that we think critically about this. So as part of the series, I've so far organized 53 events. So for people who aren't able to see the slide, it's basically just some of the posters from the series showing some of our speakers. And there's going to be about 2 more events this semester. So the reason I bring this up is because the series has helped me think really critically about what it means to do publicly engaged scholarship in research communication. Not only have I been able to learn so much from the main speakers of the series who have come at these topics from a variety of perspectives, have organized their own presentations in a variety of manners, thinking critically about the language that they're using, about the visuals they're using, about their approaches to talking about big data and AI topics. It also has made me think really critically about my own research communication. And I see this series as part of like one branch of my own work around communicating around some of the social injustices that are involved with AI and big data. In organizing this series too, I thought really critically about the design of it. So a few things about the series. So the events, every single event besides one has been completely free for everyone to access. The only one that wasn't, it was because it was in collaboration with a conference that people had to be registered for. But that was really early on in the series, and I'm pretty committed to making them free. There's this idea of them being accessible to the public, but here I want us to think really critically about what that means, because when we're thinking about our research communication practices, we might say something is free or open to everyone, but who's actually coming to the events? What is it about the spaces that you're putting your events in that might make people feel comfortable or not comfortable going to? What about the timing of the events, right? So if someone has children, maybe they can't come after work hours, but maybe some people can't come to events if they're during like 9 to 5 or 9 to 6 work hours, right? So thinking really critically about the timing and the scheduling impacts who it's open to, questions of space. Is it wheelchair accessible? Is there enough seating? Those types of things that can make a space more accessible. While during the pandemic, we've continued the series. And so for me, having live captioning done by human captioners has been really important to make it more accessible as well for people who are deaf or who have difficulty hearing or for whom English is a second language or have other kind of reasons why captions are useful. And then the issue of it being recorded and what that means about making it accessible for people who might not be able to attend at the time. So it's from my work on this series that led me to my own work thinking kind of even more broadly around public scholarship. So for those who can't see the slide, I just have a picture of the book cover of my book that's coming out in May called Engage in Public Scholarship, a guidebook on feminist and accessible communication. And so this book is divided into 2 sections. The first is thinking really critically about challenges of access and accessibility within our own public scholarship, the way we communicate our research. And the second part is really practical toolkits. So I want to give a big overview today of some things to consider, and I'm really happy to dive into any parts that you want to in more detail during the Q&A section. So the first thing is, and I think it's probably something you've been thinking a lot within this series itself around research communication, but what does it even mean to have accessible scholarship? So I think this brings up a few questions, right? Accessible for whom? So what kind of access are you actually thinking about? So you're never going to have something that is fully accessible, right? If your event is in English, it's not going to be accessible for people who don't speak English, right? So the kinds of like language accessibility, also in terms of like the time of day, the kinds of platforms it's on. If it's a virtual event, there's going to be limitations of broadband access. If it's a physical event, not everyone will be able to access that space. Probably someone in Australia isn't going to be able to go to an event in the UK, right? So, but it's also a question of like, who does it need to be accessible for is also really key. And thinking critically about who you actually want to communicate your research to, because I think when we think, oh, the public, who are we actually talking about? Are we talking about other people who are kind of invested in these issues that we want to communicate but aren't affiliated with the university? Are we interested in speaking to non-experts, whatever that may be? Are we trying to kind of broadcast a message more broadly about science or in my case, like AI, big data issues to people who might not have ever thought about these issues? Like, who is your intended audience and why? I think really thinking critically about that can help you think about like the kind of access needs that you need. But one of my concerns sometimes with this is that then we can overlook certain needs around access. So in terms of like disability advocacy. And then also when we're thinking about accessible scholarship, I think a lot of the conversations tend to really think about the people that we're imagining as receiving our research communications, right? So we're thinking of the kind of publics who, or audiences who are going to listen to our messages or read our messages or something like that. But also, is this accessible to all scholars, right? So thinking about the precarious positions of many scholars, for example, there's labor equity issues, as many of you know, there's issues of adjunctification, there's issues of non-tenure track positions, there's issues of the fact that some scholars have far greater workloads than others, there's issues of differences in compensation. And so I think that when we're asked to do research communication outside of kind of journal publications or, scholarly monographs, this is often seen as an additive thing to our work rather than a central tenet of our work. So it's another thing added to our pile of work. And that can be a huge issue. As hopefully as scholars, we also are allowed to have lives outside of our jobs. And, we have commitments to our community and to our families and friends and our hobbies and other things. The other thing that creates, and within these labor equity issues, of course, this is gendered and racialized and classed. But the other aspect of what can make accessible scholarship inaccessible for some scholars to do is issues of trolls and doxing too. I know that there can be concerns, right? If you are talking about your research outside of maybe some academic journals, right? If you're using social media to talk about your research, you're writing op-eds, you're doing public events, you're doing talks at libraries or bookstores or, spaces outside of academic conferences and academic journals, you might make yourself seen in ways to other audiences that might that you might be worried that you might start getting to be trolled or doxxed. And of course, we also see this as also being a gendered and racialized issue where women and non-binary people, scholars of color, oftentimes are trolled and doxxed in greater numbers. And for those of you who don't know, doxing is a form of trolling that is, I would say, far more intense, where there's issues of people sharing someone's personal home address, making death threats, and that kind of stuff. And many times universities don't even have systems to protect scholars who are experiencing this. And then when we're thinking about accessible scholarship too, sometimes I worry that the conversation rests with open access and open data. And I think that's a start, but doing accessible scholarship and research communication is more than just making a PDF available online. That is one way of sharing your research, but not everyone is going to read our jargon-filled academic articles. And so creating other forms of your research communication. But of course, not everything should be fully open. So there's that line, open as possible, closed as necessary, right? So we're thinking about like Indigenous data, for example, it shouldn't always be open to settler audiences and so forth. Okay, so, but I don't want to focus on negatives. I think there are a lot of benefits of doing accessible research communication, of public scholarship. I think it is really important in terms of part of our work as scholars in sharing this with other audiences. It can combat some of this kind of like post-truth era discourse. I think that it actually can strengthen your scholarship because you can get feedback from different audiences. So it's not just something that you are doing for others, but I think it can actually be quite mutually beneficial for you as a scholar. And then for me, it's actually kind of a key driver for one of the reasons I do research is I actually want it to be able to have an impact. And I think especially as many of us are at publicly funded institutions, that can be also something that I think the public should be benefiting from this work. Okay, so what can I do in choosing the right medium? I think when we're thinking about research communication, there's a lot of different tactics that you can use, and I want to talk about a few of them. And I don't want it to seem like I'm saying like, go out and do all of these things. Everyone probably is listening to this talk is feeling probably stressed out. We're in a global pandemic still. We all have increasing workloads, and there's already so much being asked of us in terms of our research, in terms of our teaching, in terms of our service requirements already with our job. And so I don't want this to feel like it's just like another thing to add to your to-do list that feels terrible. I think that with research communication, especially with publicly engaged research communication, it can actually be something that can give you more energy for your other work because it's a way of getting for a few reasons. One is that oftentimes when you're engaging with audiences that might not be part of the academy. You're getting asked new questions. It can make you consider your research in new ways. It's also really nice in that depending on your academic discipline, the kinds of journals I submit, it's like 9 months to get comments back from peer review a lot of times. It's just so slow moving, and it just feels like I'm not really getting any feedback, and it's not really going anywhere for a while. Whereas when I do public research communication, it can be kind of this instantaneous feedback. It can really make it feel like my research is actually doing something, stuff like that. So it can actually be energizing. But also, I think a lot of times as scholars, we really see ourselves as like that we need to be really great at everything that we're doing, and we have to be experts. And it can be sometimes intimidating to try new platforms or new methods of communicating our research. It can be a bit scary sometimes or off-putting, but these are skill sets that you can work on and grow. And I think it's a place that you can experiment with, and it might not be, you might try out one technique I'm going to talk about and then realize, oh, actually, I want to not do this anymore. And something I also want to bring up, which is something I don't think we talk about in academia enough, but the role of fun, which it's not a bad thing if we're actually enjoying what we're doing in our research communication. So when kind of thinking about what methods to use in your research communication, considering what might actually be fun and energizing and rewarding can be key. So I have this list here of some of the options of kind of self-produced ways, or you can also do this with collaborators, but of research communication. Now, some of these are quite, you might be like, oh, that's kind of obvious. A lot of them are digital tools, such as creating websites and blogs to share your research on, using social media, despite the downsides of it being proprietary. And yes, there can be, doom scrolling and stuff like that, but social media can be a great way to reach different audiences, creating short videos, creating podcasts or audio storytelling can be great ways to reach new audiences, as well as some people have created apps or exhibits, policy reports. There have been some scholars who have used comics and cartoons and graphic novels to share their research, audiobooks. I think another thing is that while digital tools can be great, maybe the audiences you want to reach about your own research actually aren't as online or don't have great internet access, right? So physical communication that I think we oftentimes overlook. Cheap to produce things like zines or pamphlets, doing plain language versions of our work, basically avoiding jargon, thinking of how your work can be online and offline at the same time. And then also, as is probably evident with my speaker series, I'm really into events organizing as well. I'm working with others to share research and sharing my own. And then there's also, maybe you don't actually want to learn the skill set of like, how do I record a podcast and distribute the RSS feed? So maybe you can work with others too, right? That itself is a skill set. So maybe there's someone who actually knows how to make podcasts and they want to help you share your research, and they'll help you with the audio editing, right? There's also places where it's just like, how can you work with journalists? How can you connect with journalists for interviews, right? There's different ways of like creating your own website, putting yourself on lists like informed opinions, so journalists know to reach out to you, guesting on other people's podcasts and writing op-eds. And then with all of these decisions, like questions of sustainability, both is like, is your form of research communication going to be sustainable for you in a variety of ways? So in terms of like your workload, are you going to be able to maintain the website? Sustainability in terms of also like the environmental impact aspect of whatever technologies you're using, right? Because there's always an environmental impact of everything we do. Okay, so I was worried I was going to speak too slowly. So in terms of like my like big driver behind why it's important to kind of consider a lot of these different strategies. Oh no, I just backtracked. Is that I think it's well worth it. I mean, probably everyone here attending the talk is also really dedicated to research communication. That's why you're here, right? But I do want you to think really critically about the platforms that you're choosing to use, and that it's okay to try something out for a little while and then leave it. I'm really happy to go into a lot of detail about kind of like step-by-step possibilities for doing it. I've also created an open access version of my own book, so you don't have to pay for it. I'm not like plugging it to like make money. I really created it because I wanted to take away some of the legwork that someone would need to do of like figuring out how to create their own podcast, or the things to consider in terms of organizing an event, ways to get funding for this kind of research communication, ways of like how to actually connect with journalists, ways to actually create zines and different resources. So in the like part 2 of the book, there's a lot of that kind of like step by step bit. So I ended up speaking really fast. I just realized I think I was nervous and I went through it way faster than I wanted to. I was worried I would speak for 40 minutes and then I just sped through it. It's my first time giving this talk, so I'm sorry that I did it so quickly. But yeah, I guess this will give us more time to kind of delve into specific questions. I'm really happy to talk in like greater detail about really particular aspects of any of these strategies for research communication. And I'm also curious and interested in hearing some of your own strategies as well. So thank you. So we can have a long question.